My name is Ndoko, and I'm here in the studio with Siti Muga today and having a look at conversations that are happening. We're joined by the Executive Director of Amnesty International, Irungu Houghton. It's good to have you in the Situation Room once again. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much, sir.
Great to have you here. Of course, we're looking at obviously work that you do, and of course making the news, making the stories, making the headlines, extrajudicial killings in this country, specific to Kenya, and necessarily exactly what is going on, and saying, are we going to be able to get to a place where we end, and this will not be a story that we continue to tell. I would like to look at the process and the progress and say, here we are today in 2020. Where are we?
So one is, yesterday was the anniversary of the killing of Dedan Kimathi, and I was struck really with the sense of history. And extrajudicial killings didn't just start in this period or with this generation. It really started back in the colonial period. One of our famous heroines, Mary Muthoni Nyanjiro, was killed outside of, what is now the Norfolk Hotel. And she was killed protesting against the arrest of Harry Thuku, one of our foremost nationalists.
Right.
And that was one of the first extrajudicial killings that we know. So it is something that has been around since the colonial period. But as obviously, we don't want it to go for another 100 years.
Right.
This is something that is completely within our grasp as a nation to eradicate, and I believe it could happen in our generation.
On what does this on what does this hold fast to? What must happen for that to take place? Because certain things, it's not just going to be a declaration. I won't just snap my fingers and say, okay, we need to see this end, and it ends. Yeah. On what bedrock must this be placed? So
I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that there are statistics on this. This is not a hidden problem. The Missing Voices website that has been working for two or 3 years now just released their annual report last week. In fact, they did it on Valentine's Day, which probably shocked a lot of people.
Right.
But there was a method there. There was an opportunity really to offer flowers to the widows and to the mothers of people who have lost their loved ones, And just if I can go through some of the statistics from that report, over 2019, we lost about 107 young people. What we know from the data is that 1/5, about 20% of those people died between the months of March and April. So this is the 2 months that we're leaning into now. We also know that about half of them were based in the county of Nairobi. We also know that 69% of them were between the ages of 18 and 35. This is a very young demographic. It is probably the most productive. And I guess we can call it the majority demographic. They're young people. About 72% of those cases were justified by the police as lawful killings. We would disagree with many of those cases, and I can give you specific examples, including the young Duncan Githinji, who was 2 years old, was shot by 3 bullets in Soweto, Kasarani. And as we speak now, there's only an inquest, despite the fact that the officers are known. About 10% of the cases, of these 107 cases, have led to arrests of officers. So only 10%.
So we're looking at
of these cases.
All these deaths having been brought about by the hand of the police.
Yes, these are all police shootings.
So there's justification then to say these are extrajudicial?
No, the law provides for police officers to protect other Kenyans, to protect themselves, to protect property. And that law is an important law because we don't want a situation where our officers, both our male and female officers in uniform, to be threatened by criminals or by thugs, or to be unable to protect us. I mean, this is why we have a police service. It is to protect Kenyans primarily. So not all of those cases, not all of the cases where police officers discharge their weapons are unlawful. But the cases that we have looked at under the Missing Voices project are essentially suspicious, and we would say that they are unlawful killings.
Has justice been expedited in any? Because if we're looking and saying that here, these are cases where people have been killed outside of the parameters of the law or what they are required or allowed to do. Has justice then been expedited? in any of these cases?
I mean, the thing that worries most of us who are following this, I know it keeps the Inspector General up at night, and I'm sure it keeps the Minister of Interior up at night.
Yeah.
I hope so. I mean, I mean, any decent policymaker or any decent civil servant would be very concerned that a government is essentially allowing a situation where officers, either for purposes of corruption or for purposes of just pure violence and violence against other citizens, that they would allow this to happen. And I hope this does keep people up at night until we find a solution. But I think the examples are, less than 10% of the cases I've given you have led to arrests. We know that there is a policy of transferring officers rather than interdicting them or arresting them. We have I don't think there's one case where we've seen an immediate arrest of an officer for shooting a citizen. And, it would be great to have the police spokesperson on this show also to just respond to these issues. So I don't think that we have a zero tolerance to unlawful killings yet. And the reason for that, I think, is that the public have not really made this a big agenda. And as we say in Amnesty, the violent policing is not an answer to violent crime. So there are people out there who are frightened, who are being terrorized by criminals. We've had cases in places like Madara and Andorra and other places where women are unable to walk at night. And that is also a human rights violation. So the police have to be able to provide protection, but they cannot also prey on other Kenyans.
Well, of course, the question comes in then, who polices whom? Because if you're asking then, what we're basically asking is that you then look within yourselves where we find fault, right? And then do something about that. What is the likelihood that I'm going to actually say, I am the one who has done this, and then I then should have some kind of punishment on myself? Yeah. It's very low. How then do we deal with it? Yeah. This is the thing. How then do you deal with an issue like that?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the glimmer of light is that we're 10 years into the Constitution. This is the decade, the first decade of our Constitution. And what it has given us is it has given us laws, it has given us structures, it has given us policies that we can use to tackle these issues. This was not the case back in 2010. Let me just give you a few of them. The Inspector General is an independent institution. It is not at the beck and call of the executive. That's the first important thing. So his priority focus must be on professionalizing the police service, right? There can be no other purpose for an Inspector General but to create a professional, modern police force that is humane and is effective in fighting crime. The second thing is that we now have two other institutions, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority and we have the Internal Affairs Unit. Those two units need to be on the ground constantly whenever these incidents happen. And in the case of Daniel Borough, and I do hope we'll be able to get the National Border Association chairperson to come in. In the case of this young 24-year-old border rider who was essentially a good Samaritan, and he was shot in the chest simply for refusing to pay 50 shillings to come into Mama Lucy hospital to essentially deliver a child that actually died. I mean, this was a golden hour moment. Not only did we lose the child, but we lost the Good Samaritan.
Right.
And we lost the Good Samaritan at the hands of a police officer. I mean, this is completely bizarre in many ways. So there are institutions now that prevent this from happening. But I think what I would like to see as Amnesty is I would like to see the Police Inspector General taking immediate action on officers. They need to be suspended and interdicted, not transferred.
I mean, yeah, for sure. And we're going to try and see if we can get the chairman on the phone, of course, later to pick at that case. If we look at cases that we saw, for example, in Kisumu about a month ago, of course, there was a case where a boy, we're going to call him a boy, he was under 20, and he was trying to help his cousin who had been hit by a vehicle, trying to get him to hospital. And then thereafter, police came on the scene without many questions asked. He was shot, lost his life. There's another boy in hospital. The questions were asked to the regional commissioner thereafter, and that case has essentially died. We don't hear that anybody was brought to book. Nobody was brought to question. He said he was going to have a conversation with his officers, and that is where it ended. Now, how are we going to see cases like this take center stage where something will actually be done about them? Because then essentially nobody asked the question that this life that has been lost, what are we going to do about it?
So that particular case, I think is the case of Mark Ochieng. And
Yes.
in many ways, it was also complicated in the sense that it was a public order case. I mean, what happened was, a young man, actually a boy, a 17-year-old boy by the name of Kevin Sumba, was knocked by a car, and then a altercation happened between the police and the public, and it ended fatally in the death of Mark Ochieng. And I think there are a number of concerns there. First of all is the speed at which police officers discharge their weapons. I mean, the question is really, why do we have police officers with live bullets doing traffic control? Right. I mean, this is the first question that we should be asking, because it's just a split second for that weapon to be discharged, and we lose a life. From what we know, Mark Ochieng was unarmed. He was, yes, maybe among a crowd of people that were challenging the police officers, but that was no reason to have him
essentially
shot dead.
Challenging them for this vehicle that knocked down his cousin, right?
Correct. Actually, he was seeking justice in that moment.
At that point.
So I think one of the things that we have to demand from the police is for them to review the way in which they manage public order. And we don't have much time. If you think about this is what we call the sane season. This is the season in between the electoral periods. When we move into the crazy season, you have the complexity of people struggling with their basic living costs, people struggling with law and order issues, but you have on top of that electoral dynamics where the political class is whipping their followers in any direction. And I think what I'm worried about is that if we don't deal with this in 2020, 2021, we are likely to see a repeat of 2017.
Let me ask the question. If you look at, say, for instance, the killing of Osama bin Laden or Qasem Soleimani, would it fall under the broad category of extrajudicial killing?
So I'm not familiar with those two cases. I mean, it's an interesting conversation, but and I know I was asked this question about Osama bin Laden by Jerry Thorne, so I should perhaps have done my homework and come to the session. I think for us, the definition of an extrajudicial killing is a distinct one, and it is distinct in the sense that, from a legal perspective, a government declares war on a category of people. Now, in this case, we have no declaration of war by the Kenyan government. There is no policy that says shoot 107 people every year and essentially make sure that 69% of them are between the ages of 18 and 35. We have no policy like that. As Amnesty and as the human rights organizations in our community, what we are saying is there must be a policy to ensure that violent policing, unlawful killings, I guess we'd call disproportionate use of force comes to an end. And we do not see violent policing as a response to violent crime, even if that is the case.
Even if that is the case. I'm sure you've had many conversations, and I want to assume that, of course, you've had conversations with those who, as Amnesty or as other, invested groups, with the leadership of the police, for example. I would really be interested in what the response has been. Do they acknowledge the fact that these things actually are occurring?
So we have, for every time Amnesty goes into the public or is involved in a media action of some sort on an extrajudicial killing, we probably have 3 or 4 interactions with the police service, and sometimes at very high levels, either the level of the Inspector General or the Minister of Interior. In fact, 2 months ago, he made a very large conference, chuckle in laughter by saying that he has monthly communion with the Amnesty Executive Director. And people were not quite sure what he meant by this. But what it means is that we are actually in conversation, we are actually in dialogue with the authorities, because we believe that it is their responsibility. It's not the responsibility of average citizens or the Border Association or Amnesty International to keep people safe. It is the responsibility of the state. And we will not tire of reminding them on every case that happens that this is not happening, or congratulating them when they take action. And there have been cases, and this is to the heart of your question, there have been cases where we have seen the minister move decisively. The police reforms that were announced 2 years ago were a decisive moment. The invitation to human rights organizations to come and speak truth to police officers in the National Policing Conference a year ago was a decisive moment. The arrests of, or the interdictions of the officers that were caught in a viral video beating up a student at Jomo Kenyatta University College, that interdiction was a decisive movement. What we are not seeing really is a zero tolerance for these cases. And I think we continue to call on the Inspector General not to rely on IPOA, not to rely on the Internal Affairs Unit. It is a managerial, administrative responsibility of the Inspector General to discipline his officers. And if he cannot discipline his officers, then at the lower levels, the county commissioners, the sub-commanders and the officers in charge of the stations, they are culpable when their officers take action and they're not disciplined.
But if we discuss the outcomes of these actions, which lead to what we call extrajudicial killing, is the question of why these things occur, is it asked enough?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, CK, that's a great question. I mean, do we spend enough time thinking about what are the conditions that give rise to unlawful policing and the excessive use of force? And I think that for me, there are three things that I've learned in the last 2 years, and I've come into Amnesty, and it's really this is also a new area for me. But the first is that we tend to blame one party or the other. And we don't understand the ecosystem, the context in which this happens. So there are neighborhoods that are extremely violent. Right? So it's neither violent crimes nor violent policing. It's neither criminals nor police. We need to understand this as a way in which we keep all people safe. And that's the first one. I can hear the music going, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're going to take a break in a short while and have a look at weather, but it's very interesting for us to then come back and then understand how we're going to be able to look at this against some of the things that you're talking about. Now, for example, where you have dangerous communities, dangerous neighborhoods, dangerous areas, then is that justification for some of the, the violence and the killings that we see? We're in the Situation Room. We're in the room this morning with the Executive Director of Amnesty International, Irungu Houghton, and we're looking at possibly ending extrajudicial killings in the country. We're going to continue with that point that you had, Irungu, at some point. But right now, we have the case that we talked about yesterday, or today, rather, and we have on the line Kevin Mubadi, who is the chair of the Association of Border Riders. He's on the line right now and probably going to give us a little bit more insight in terms of what happened and what they plan for today. Kevin, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I'm very fine, but not that much fine.
Tell us what makes you not fine this morning. Irungu gave us a little bit about this information of what you plan for today, based on what happened. With one of your members.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. The sad news came in yesterday, where one of our members was just trying to rescue a child who was drowning in the river, and he was taking him to Mama Lucy Hospital. But when he arrived at the hospital, this was an emergency case, and so he had to rush into the hospital and parked the motorbike, took the child inside. When he came out, there was this security guard who was there, and he wanted some bribe, that is 50 shillings for the parking, for allowing him to park inside. But when the rider said that, no, I was just trying to rescue a child who was in danger, and I don't have this much money to pay right now. So they started some scuffle with the security guard, who refused to release the motorbike to him.
Right.
But when the security guard saw that the guy has refused to pay, so he called the police and told the police that this guy is unruly and he's causing some mayhem there. So when the police officer, the AP officer came, the scuffle continued, but because the police and the riders, they always have this tendency of how do you call it, madarau. Yani they take riders as a nobody, So what happens? The police just cocked the gun and shot the guy in the chest. And when he was rushed into the hospital, inside the hospital, in an emergency room, the guy died there.
And this happened yesterday.
Yeah, it happened yesterday. The police officer disappeared. There was some little scuffle. People tried to demonstrate, but as an organization, we have alerted all our members not to demonstrate, because as an organization, are trying to see a reform in the sector, and we just want justice to be done in a transparent way. We don't want to cause mayhem. We don't want to do demonstrations. I have urged all our members to keep calm. We want to follow this issue in a civil way. So today we are going to have a press briefing to update our members and the public on this issue. But we just urge the IPOA, the Inspector General of Police, the CS Interior, Dr. Matiang'i, to ensure that justice is done to this lady. The guy was only 24 years, a very young man, hardworking, earning a living. He was not a thief. You see, and he was a good Samaritan. He was just trying to save this
somebody,
child.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, he was helping somebody. So you help someone and you die. You rescue someone as you die. It's very, very painful. And when you look at the mother of this young man, it is like they have taken away his source of income. The only thing that maybe he had that would provide for her. And losing a child of 24 years is something very painful after suffering all those years trying to bring him up. Yeah. So it's a very painful day for us as a Boda community, but we are just keeping calm. We have urged all our members to keep calm and to ensure that the government follows this issue and justice be done to this young man.
Essentially, what you will do today is a protest. That's what's going to happen. Whether it will be silent, non-violent, it's going to be a protest. Do you think that it's going to... Do you hope?
No. What you have urged for now, we don't want to do some protest.
So you're
want our
sharing information to be aware of what's going on.
Yes, today we will meet at Uhuru Park with the media fraternity just to share a statement on what is going on and what we want the government to do for us.
Do you think that
we are not going to do demonstration.
Okay. Do you think that is going to be enough at this point?
At this point, because the government has not come out to tell us what is happening, because they already said that the investigation have started. So for the time being, as a civil people, we want to give them time and chance to ensure that things work out well. Maybe later, if they are not going to act, that's when now the demonstration can come in. But at the moment, it is still early stage. We are giving the government a chance to prove that they mean whatever they say. Yes.
All right. Kevin, thank you very much for speaking to us. Of course, we'll be following this and finding out, what happened during the day today. On that, of course, the losses of one is much too much, and it's something that has to be followed. And thank you very much for joining us in the Situation Room this morning and telling us about this particular incident.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
The thing that I think sometimes gets a bit confusing, if you sort of like Google search and you look at countries that have records of judicial killing, the issue is which ones do you leave out?
Where do you start?
Where do you stop? Because one, the Southern American countries, it's like you can pinpoint almost any country you think. If you go to Southeast Asia, same story. If you come to this continent, again, for every stone you will throw, you'll probably hit every country that there is. Now, this is why I asked the question, do we ask enough? Why is it that, because for something to happen that frequently, it's being allowed to.
Yeah, by the time, Irungu, that you're able to, get statistics, right? You have numbers year in, year out. That means it's happening at a rate that is enough for you then to collect these statistics.
Let me give an example. Usually when you have criminals, especially in the areas that were referred to by Irungu as dangerous, you'll hear, say, the Minister for Interior saying, I have given a shoot to kill order. Now, is that not giving express permission for extrajudicial killing?
Right, because if we're going to, it might sound like a very naive question, right, Irungu, but if we're going to talk about extrajudicial killings, then that means then there are judicial killings. There are those that are allowed. So where do we cross the line?
So I guess there's two levels of this conversation, which is a great conversation to have. The first is, what are the drivers of extrajudicial killings? Right? What is it that generates? And I think there are probably three levels. The first is high levels of inequality, low levels of hope, low levels of opportunity for jobs, for employment. I mean, what we've been told by community organizers in places like Dandora and Mathare, that when the National Youth Service program was running and we were actually occupying people in lawful, I guess lucrative jobs, you saw a dip in the crime, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is the criminal justice system is not working. Where you have a, you have a loss of faith, a loss of confidence that somebody who is arrested will have their chance to plead their innocence in court. They will have a lawyer. They'll be processed through a separation between an investigator, a prosecutor, a judge, and then they will go into the correctional services. And that system works. You tend not to have this situation where people say the best thing is just shoot them.
Right.
Our prisons are full.
Yeah.
Right.
We're not having the conversation.
Yeah. The third level is really the lack of leadership and the lack of managerial oversight that says this is unacceptable. This is not policing. This is not a way in which you reduce levels of crime. Essentially, what you're doing is creating a much more violent society, because what the criminals know that actually there's going to be no opportunity for them to go to court. So the first thing they will do is they will fire back. And in many cases, you will have deaths as a result of the altercation between police officers and violent criminals. And those are, I guess, in those circumstances, it is lawful for a police officer to protect themselves or to protect other people or to protect property. It is lawful for that to happen. That is actually under our laws. But in many cases, what we are seeing is that this is not the case. That what you have is a underworld of criminals and police officers who are essentially meshed together in interest of extortion. And, I think for me, the concern is that we are not seeing a decisive set of actions that are bringing this to an end. And I can just give you two examples. Carlton Minor, the 24-year-old from... 22-year-old from Kibra, who was killed in December last year. It is now 14 months since that he's been killed. No single officer has been arrested.
I would like to know, I think it would be very interesting for us to know the process and where we are at this point, because then I would ask another question, but I'm going to have to ask that. And if just before we went into break, giving us those two examples, Irungu, of cases where we see that, it could be that we're at a standstill, nothing is happening, time has elapsed, and the questions are still in the air.
So I think one of the things, some good news. I think let's also kind of look on the bright side. So from what we hear from community organizers in places like Kibra and Dandora, that actually extrajudicial killings and violent policing reduced last year, right? Which is interesting.
And why is that?
So their analysis essentially is that the publicity that that was drawn to this issue in 2018 was enough to create a deterrent. But the other thing they said was that there were some leadership changes at the level of the police service. And that's why I have hope that when you have officers that understand the purpose of why they are there, it is possible to change, divisions and to change, I guess, police, areas that are policed by particular jurisdictions. So, the getting the right officers in the places where there are high levels of violence actually makes a difference. And I think one of the things that we would be, looking at, more intensely in 2020 is beginning to look at actually who is responsible, who are the sub-commanders, what we used to call the officer in charge of the police divisions. Who are they in relationship to the numbers that we are seeing? So we can begin to make a link between this particular, police manager, if I can use, language that is not, but this police commander. They're managers.
They are essentially managers,
yes. Chief executive. There's a chief executive. There's a managers. How are they managing the professionalism of the police officers below them? And is there a relationship between the levels of crime in a particular area, the levels of extrajudicial killings in a particular area, vis-a-vis the officer in charge of that area? And I think this is the other thing that is clear to us, is that when you have officers that want to make a difference, that difference will happen.
If we do, it sounds though that it sounds like something that's up in the air and wrapped in theory.
No. Statistically, I'm telling you that the numbers of people who died,
but having it
in
established,
Dandora and Kibra reduced last year.
Right, but if we're going to
say that... It didn't happen in Madare. It didn't happen in Kaloleni.
Sure, but it seems that the crux of the matter here would be to have such replicated across the country, whereby we have other volatile areas. But then it is still within the purview of the person at the top to make these appointments. Yeah. How do we then influence at that level?
So accountability happens at various, very, very many levels. And for your viewers, many of them are not police officers. I'm sure some of them are police officers, so that the message is clear for them. But for normal citizens, the question is, what can we do about this issue? Right? And I've said this to senior government officers. If your children do not have T-shirts that say, I am the child of the cabinet secretary, I am the child of a principal secretary, don't shoot me. You are likely to have a situation where your children, your very family members, are as much risk as the children that we see in places like Dandora and for that matter, in the coast as well, because that's another area where we've been really concerned about extrajudicial killings. So the message to citizens really is that they need to raise these issues as much as possible. They need to join organizations and support organizations.
That was going to be my next question. Where? How? Because that's the thing. A lot of people will say that, okay, I can do this. I can talk about it in my local area. Whom? I mean, practically, Irungu, who are people supposed to go to? Where are you supposed to raise this? Because, of course, there's a general feeling that, talk about police. Look, the question is that they don't give a damn. Right? Kill somebody, it's a nuisance they've gotten rid of.
Right.
And that could be the general thinking. We don't know what the thinking is of each and every police officer, but it's the perception that it is a general thinking that you've gotten rid of a nuisance.
Yeah, I mean, that perspective, we put it slightly differently. Your silence as a citizen kills people, right? Your disdain or your disinterest in what happens around violent policing is actually part of the cause that this continues to happen. The more people who write, for example, yesterday we saw this case of Daniel Boro. How many citizens picked up a pen? In the old days, we used to pick up pens. In these days, probably we type something.
Right.
How many people wrote a letter to the Minister of Interior, to the Inspector General, and said, I want this investigated? How many members of Parliament received letters from their constituents saying this issue happened in a particular constituency? What is the level of oversight that the police are now expected to have from the parliamentary committees? What Amnesty International, what are you doing about this issue? I mean, one of the things that, that really gives us courage and gives us a sense of purpose is when the public reach out to us and say, we don't want you to be silent on this issue. So there are things that can happen. There are social justice centers, about 18 of them in this country. They're community-based paralegal, legal aid centers. They are operating on purely fumes and air. We celebrated the first, the life of Caroline Mwatha about a week ago, last Saturday. And she died, as people probably remember, about a year ago. And she was a volunteer that essentially took statements from family members of people who had been killed by police officers. Now, she was a complete volunteer. She had no salary. She basically had to do a side hustle in order to feed her family. But this is something that she did with very meager meals. My question is, if we have an emerging middle class in this country, how long do you want human rights protection to be supported by middle class communities outside of the country? And at what point does it become important to you to be able to get into your car knowing that you will be safe, be able to go to a mall knowing that you'll be safe, knowing that you can get to a hospital like Mama Lucy, and not have a situation where another human being, is killed for 50 shillings?
Because that's it, right?
That's it.
Something as simple as that.
That's
50
the dividing line.
Is the reason. 50 shillings is the reason why this individual was killed yesterday.
No.
Aha.
No.
CK will.
Is this something
CT.
else?
No.
At this point, they asked him to pay the 50
No.
shillings. They got into a scuffle.
The person who wanted the 50 shillings and the person who actually did the shooting, two different incidences here. This is an AP. A lot of these killings seem to have been, every time it comes up, you hear the term AP more often than regular police. So you have to ask the question, what is it about the training of the APs? What is it about the way they go about their business that makes them come to the fore every time you hear of, when you have a police shooting or killing, it is more likely to be an AP. Why?
Of course.
And it isn't 50 shillings.
The perception is rife that the administration police and their training, for example, and this could be something that could be looked at. When we look, of course, we're looking at the side where there needs to be public participation. And if you have a rising middle class that needs to then do something about it, even by using the tool of voice. However, on the side of training, which is something that needs to be looking at, a lot of people have a blatant fear of the administration police because of how they've been trained, and they give off this feeling of, we really don't care. Y'all are, vermin that we will have to get rid of to reach our expected end. That's the perception that a lot of people have.
Remember the case of a lawyer and the client who were killed. The people involved in this case, again, were APs. You see, when I raised the question, it was specific and deliberate. You cannot have cases of this sort recurring as often as these, and you don't ask the question, why? What is it about it? It's not just policemen think they can get away with it. That plays a part into it. But what sort of mindset is it that these particular individuals have that makes it their solution to a problem is do away with the person who seems to be at the heart of the problem.
So there are a couple of things here. First of all, the person that that demanded the 50 shillings was the guard at the Mamalusi hospital. So
yes.
you're technically correct, CT. But it was the same officer, security officer, who referred this young man to the administrative police. The bigger question, I think, is an interesting one, which is the administrative police more violent? Is it more lawless than the regular police service?
That's the perception out there, Irungu.
Perception, but I think it's important that Kenyans understand this. In 2018, the president stood before the nation and said that he is going to bring the command and control of both of these arms of the police service under the Inspector General. So, frankly speaking, I mean, we lost it because we got fascinated by blue uniforms. And this is somehow, as citizens, we have to be a bit more focused in terms of watching the state. It wasn't really about putting all the officers in one uniform. It was really about bringing all the officers under one command structure. So, frankly speaking, it doesn't matter whether it was an administrative police officer that killed, that did kill Duncan Burrow, or a regular police officer. What is important is that that administrative officer, the two officers that were there, that they are under a sub-commander. And that sub-commander is responsible for all the police services, all the law enforcement agencies, including chiefs, for that matter, and including the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, because that is the new structure that we've got. And then the question, therefore, is, once we know who is responsible for holding that officer accountable, the question is there human rights education, human rights training that needs to be accelerated among the police? Does
it exist? Let's ask the question.
So
if it
at
actually
Kiganjo,
exists.
there are courses that are, that happen within the police service, or police cadets as they essentially graduate to go to the streets. But the concern really is that they may not really be, two levels of intervention, and this is. It's beginning to happen. So the first intervention is regular human rights conversations with human rights organizations. I mean, one of the things that I take a lot of time to do is to actually meet with police officers, because I like to get into their own understanding of their role, because then you can understand the pressures that they have, the inabilities that they find themselves, and also what is it that makes a police officer snap and shoot somebody rather than arrest them. Right? And I think that's something that I think all human rights organizations need to do more of. But the second thing really is the trauma counseling that is now happening among police service. And not a lot of people know this publicly, but there is now a process of looking at how do wounded officers, wounded both physically and emotionally, how do they get rid of the trauma of that so that they're not walking around with post-traumatic stress and therefore liable to just exert pressure and violence on other citizens. So these are the two things that could make a difference. The third one, and I often say this, is actually gender balanced or gender parity in patrolling is an important thing, and it's particularly important for women. But having two men patrolling by themselves, I think is one of the recipes for having the kind of disaster we saw in 2017, when something like 206 women were raped, and some of them gang raped in a period of 5 months.
Yeah. So all of these are, of course, suggestions that are being made. In terms of them having played out, do we see them coming to fruition? Suggestions that you make in your monthly communion, for example, do they actually then come out? Or do you see that these could be something that we could see in the future? Because if we're talking about ending judicial killings in the country, essentially, some of these things will come in place before we get to that expected end.
Yeah. I mean, the data collection that is done by the Missing Voices, and it's a website, so people can go to the website. It's missingvoices.co.k. You can look at the evidence for yourself. You can do your own analysis. It essentially is an opportunity for the researchers, the research community, but also the police to be able to look at how well are they doing. My question often is, why don't we have similar statistics from the police? Why don't we have similar statistics from the Ministry of Interior? Because I think once you begin to generate data and you have an evidence-based conversation, there's an opportunity to get beyond the drama of accusations and blame and actually look at what is happening. And just that simple, statistic that actually in places like Kibra and in Dandora, the figures went down.
Let me ask the question, Irungu. It actually
wasn't burning yet?
Not
Okay.
really. It's just that I was thinking about it, and I was thinking that have we actually ever overcome the initial purpose for which the administration police was actually put in place? Remember, it began as the tribal police, 1929, and their purpose was really not complicated. To make sure that these native Africans were put in their place by whatever means possible. All right? And you also have the GSU, who for the longest time were known as Fanya Fujo Uone. So essentially, what happened to communities that the colonial administration deemed to be hostile, that attitude was passed on. So whenever the government of the day felt that there were parts of the citizenry who were not towing the line, they would unleash the GSU on you. What this brings to mind is, it's like these aren't regularly trained. These are paramilitary trained, meaning they are supposed to deal with insurgents. They're supposed to deal with emergency situations. They are actually not trained to deal with civilians on a daily basis, not really. So their whole reaction to anything that you see before them isn't actually tuned. It's like asking the army to police. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen?
And isn't that taken into consideration then when it comes to then policing? To say that there's still remnants?
Clearly
not.
it hasn't been taken into consideration.
It seems that there's a conversation that has not even been had before you start talking about then putting things in place to then have this. Because there are clearly remnants of this attitude taking place here. It's some of the things that we see with the
But
killings that we saw
clearly
yesterday.
it also is a thinking that there's a remnant of the understanding by whoever is in government that you need a unit such as this one to put down any person or individuals who you feel may be a threat to you.
Is that necessary, Irungu?
But, I mean, why do you have such a unit?
Yeah.
Why?
So historically, I think the history of the administrative police is very clear. It was essentially a brutal force, and it was, as you said, it was just to ensure that the natives did not become restless and challenge the colonial settler. We don't require paramilitary policing. We are not in a state of insurgency. In the case of the Kenya Defence Forces, in August last year, a young man by the name of Yusuf Kasim was shot in Garissa, and a number of us travelled to Garissa to provide advice, legal advice, and also to just solidarity, moral solidarity with the family. And we held a demonstration where we basically marched across the streets of Garissa to simply make the point that the Kenya Defence Forces, who have a military camp in Garissa, should not be essentially policing Garissa. And there's enough evidence. This case has now gone to an inquest. There's enough case to suggest that actually this young man, Yusuf Kassam, was killed as he was coming home late at night at 10 o'clock. And there are some allegations of theft and so on. Now, the key point here is we demanded that base be removed from Garissa town. Now, the good news is, I think somewhere towards the end of the year, that base was actually announced. It was actually announced by the president that the base will be removed from Garissa and taken to another part of the country that is not, I guess, populated by civilians. And I think this point is very important. The administrative police cannot use the same tactics as a paramilitary force or as a paramilitary force, essentially, to police civilians. If they are to police, then they must be brought under the police standing orders that regulate the National Police Service.
Right.
And they cannot. I mean, I think we must demand this as citizens, that you cannot allow people in uniform paid by taxpayers' monies to brutalize other Kenyans.
Now, is it possible to end extrajudicial killings in Kenya? Is it possible with what we see?
It is.
It is not only possible, it is desirable. It is critical for the stability of this country. Violent policing does not, violent policing, the death penalty does not reduce the crime statistics. In many cases, what we found is that actually the communities are so frightened of the police that they don't yield intelligence, they don't yield information. And that's why the economic survey says something like, I think the increase of crime last year was 31%. It's up 31%. but the number of people who are giving evidence to the police is just only 5%, right? So violent policing actually shuts the police, or rather locks out the police from its capacity to work effectively and be able to target and arrest the criminals that are preying on other Kenyans. So I think that's the first thing. It is not just, it's not just possible, it is actually desirable. And we have to get this in place in the next year or so. As I say, there is a looming revisiting of 2017 if we do not fix this. And it will be found in the area of public order management. Let me give you just two examples very quickly.
Right.
Stephen Makarusi, who was the young man, 17 years, who was killed at the Kasarani Mwiki demonstration.
Yes.
You remember, that was a demonstration. And I think that was, in many ways, a turning point, because it wasn't a conversation around crime. It wasn't a conversation around an altercation between the police and the civilians. What it was a group of civilians demanding that their roads were of a certain quality. Now, what we found was that within 48 hours, the money was found or located through the intervention of the Nairobi senator.
Right.
And the money was actually found. So the question is, what is happening to our public resources that you cannot fix roads? And then when people demonstrate, first of all, the police kill somebody, but secondly, actually, the demonstration yields the funding that was required.
In the first place, right?
So there is a systemic failure here, not just at the level of the police service, but also at the level of the government. And I've often said that, our police service are actually asked to do the dirty job. When the state fails to provide services, when it fails to provide opportunities for jobs, what happens is our police officers are brought in to essentially police a dysfunctional state and a dysfunctional economy, right? And I think at some point the Inspector General should say, listen, it's not my job to police people who have no jobs, who have
it's not their job to sort out social issues.
These are social problems.
Yes.
But we often see this, whether you want to look at the police force and you want to look at issues of human rights, whether you want to look at education, whether you want to look at health, there is a general lack of goodwill. There's a general lack of acceptance of responsibility to have something done. Obviously, this is something that is affecting this sector as well. When we're talking about extrajudicial killings, how are we going to get somebody to change their mind or to act on something for which they really don't want to?
Actually, no. The police, I believe, want to bring about change. But consider also, if you think the general public are victims, so are the police. They do not live in a society outside this one of ours. If we have pressures and we have economic ills, so do they.
Well, people don't go around shooting people because they can't figure something out, right?
Yes, that is a simplistic way of looking at it, but we don't have the responsibilities they do. If somebody's under the same pressure as you, and then you add additional pressure of dealing with pressures that amount as a result of these pressures that they have, this is a tinder keg. We can blame them as much as we like, but the pressures that the rest of us feel are heaped upon them, and then you heap responsibility upon them on top of the burden that they already have. I am saying this, given their training and given their pressures and given their social circumstances, they are likely to react in the most irrational way. They are likely to explode. This is what I'm saying. These cases are too many. We are not talking about the times when the policemen kill other policemen. It happens very often too.
Yeah.
But in this case, I mean, with what you started off with, the statistics that we saw, and trying to say, look, if we're talking about ending this thing, then there are very, very many factors that need to work in tandem. We can't say that one then has to be sorted out, and then when we're done with that, we go to the next. It seems that so many things need to be happening at the same time.
But I don't think we need to complicate this matter. It's not a complicated problem, right? And this is why I think, sometimes we tend to get paralyzed. Two observations. The average age of a criminal or a petty offender, a police officer, and the people that we've just talked about in terms of the missing voices analysis, the average age is between 18 and 35. That's the demographic. And this always shocks me. So the average age of our police officers and the people that they are trying to arrest are roughly the same demographic, right? Which means that you're having to deal with young people, right? Now, the question for me, and I hope this is the question also for the police service, is how do you create disciplined officers? I mean, the one thing that, the language of the police service is discipline. It is true, the second observation I think that CT has raised, police officers kill police officers. They don't just kill their peers, they kill their superiors. Right? And there are many cases of this. So the lawlessness that comes with violent policing doesn't just find itself in the streets of Kenya. It finds itself in the police barracks. It finds itself in the police lines. And I think that's why this issue is really a collective problem that doesn't allow for us to take sides. Except on the grounds of how do we bring this to an end.
Okay.
Right? So I'm as happy speaking to police officers as I am to human rights defenders. And sometimes I even argue that police officers, first and foremost, must see themselves as human rights defenders.
It would be very interesting to hear and to understand then what is the view that comes from police officers. We're going to take a break now and get to the top of the hour. And if you let us keep you around for 10 minutes or so thereafter to hear what it is that could be the thinking or the psyche of a lot of police officers who basically have been tasked with this job and then find themselves at the other end of the rifle in this case. So we're going to come back and talk about that. This is the Situation Room. We're having a serious conversation this morning about extrajudicial killings in this country and probably seeking the end of that. Stay around with us. Of course, you can call in at this point, 0719-012-600. Let us know if you do have any questions and let's see how we can open this up. Irungu Houghton, and looking at the necessity to end extrajudicial killings before we get to rising temperatures in 2022 elections, for example, which we've seen as, times when some of these things get or fly out of the window. It seems like we've put a timeline on this, Irungu. I know you're going to be with us just for a few more minutes before we're going to let you go. But it seems that we've put a target on this. And is it possible to work with something as volatile as this with timelines?
I mean, I would come at this with the clarity of Wangari Maathai. Wangari once said, when's the best time to plant a tree? If you didn't plant it yesterday, it's today. And when's the next best time to plant a tree? It's tomorrow. So I think the 2022 elections is one deadline that we need to be conscious of. But I think what we need to remember is that for the families of people like Daniel Boro, who lost his life yesterday, that's abstract. I mean, for them, they've lost their child and they can't understand why they would have lost their child, particularly as he was taking an act of just compassion for this young child. So we have to take action immediately, and it's not complicated. Again, it's just it's a conversation. It's a decision that's taken. There are decisions, for example, in the case of Daniel Boro, that would leave me more confident in terms of the zero tolerance within the police service. The first one was announce the names of the officers. Secondly, interdict them, and thirdly, prosecute them. This would be a immediate step to this. Don't rely on the Independent Policing Authority to basically take the next 6 months to do the investigations, and then at that point it'll be referred to the DPP, and then that will take another 6 months. If I had influence over the Inspector General, I would say, listen, I am taking a stand on my officers that says they cannot use lethal force on other Kenyans. It's just not the principle or the vision of a police service that I want to serve. And it is, there are examples. Joash Mbati, I don't know if you remember him. He was an administrative police officer. He came across a group of thieves in a vehicle, and the public cheered on him to kill them. Ooh, ooh, ooh is what they were shouting. We all saw this on a viral video. And he decided that he was not going to do that. He'd made a different choice. And that choice that he made was to essentially to arrest them and have them prosecuted. He received a commendation by the Deputy Inspector General of the Administrative Police under the Inspector General. But more importantly, I think his choice was one step away from impunity, lawlessness, and more violence, and a step towards an effective policing and accountable policing. We need more Joash Mbatis among us. And, Manu Chandari every year sponsors, I think with the Standard, I think you're involved in this, a Good Officers Award. And I think, for those of us in Amnesty, we often say that actually we do need good officers.
Right.
We are not against officers. We need good officers. But we need to make the distinction. And we need to ask, the police service essentially to start reporting on its own officers.
We know for a fact that at Kiganjo, there's no special training for bad police officers. They all they all undergo the same training. It's not as though there's a select few who are told, now you are going to undergo this training where you will be specialized in extrajudicial killing. So somewhere along the line, the rot sets in. Okay. My final question to I'm saying it, but it won't be.
It won't be the final one. No.
Is, do we have an effective mental health program that caters for those who are in the police service?
So there is this is one of the breakthroughs, I think, of 2019, and specifically I mentioned the Inspector General of the National Police Service, Hilary Mutambai. What he did was essentially introduce training for officers on trauma counselling. And it's been run by a non-governmental organisation with professional counsellors. And we were at the event last week. Amnesty was invited to the event last week to just understand the training that's happening. We can only wish them well. We can only encourage that to take to be rolled out across the country. And in so doing, I think what it will do is it will actually reduce some of the tensions that officers have had. I've sat with officers who have told me that 12 years ago, and this was in the Kilimani division, an officer told me about a story about how I think it was 12 years before we were having this conversation, he was stabbed repeatedly in a dark alley somewhere in Mombasa, and every time he goes out to his beat, he sweats. Right, it's uncontrollable.
For fear,
right? Because he can still feel what it was like to have a knife, several knives,
plunging into
him. And I could only, I was only left with a sense of courage that this man can get up every day, put on a new uniform, go out and police in places like Kibra, not knowing whether he's going to go home. And I think the danger is real, not just for citizens; it's also real for police officers. And the more that we can, I think, support officers to essentially be lawful and effective in their policing, and support them with information that is able to isolate who the violent criminals are, so that they can be arrested and taken through the judicial process, the more we will be safer as a country.
Right. So, I mean, just looking at it, is it possible? I mean, we're saying that we're getting to a time in 2020 where we're likely to see the volatility of a situation rise in temperatures. What we're saying is that we're hoping that an attitude change would have taken place sufficient enough to realize that this is what we are seeing and this is what could come about if we don't take that into check.
So the laws and the broad policies are in place. I mean, this is, I think we can
agree on that.
The laws we agree, but
yes.
Let me ask again. Does the police force have a program or a process that they have considered in making them more user-friendly to the public?
Yeah, so like a customer service.
Yes, because our
strategy.
police, the image that the common Mwananchi has of the police is not pleasant or friendly.
I mean, it is one of the things that we've actually discussed with several police officers, whether at the level of the stations. The role of an officer in charge of a station now is actually much more complex than it was even 2 years ago, because that officer is now responsible for managing not just the regular police service, but the administrative police service, has jurisdiction over the chiefs and the assistant chiefs, and also has responsibility for the Directorate of Criminal Investigation as well. So there are a number of agencies that historically, in the case of, for example, if you take the case of Willie Kimani, one of the things that made that very complicated was administrative police officers, who obviously were corrupted and misusing the law, took the three gentlemen and placed them in containers. And there is no occurrence book that the administrative police use separately from the one that we have in police stations. It was an ungazetted police station in that sense. It was basically a container. And I think what the reforms have given us as an opportunity now is to just have a point of accountability. What we need now to work is that those officers, not just the ones who pull the trigger, but those officers who do not take action on the officers that pull the trigger, that they are also held culpable.
That they're also held culpable.
That's the difference. I mean, what we do know in all our spaces is that culture eats policy and strategy for breakfast, right? So just because we have laws, just because we have policies, just because we have an announcement of police reforms, if we are not actively working on this culture, we are going to have a culture and a constitution that actually bear no resemblance. They're not a mirror for each other.
Irungu, it's always enlightening to have you here. Thank you very much. Of course, hoping to see that things actually do change on both sides of the divide, wherever they are, and looking at ending extrajudicial killings in this country, hoping to have a total attitude change overall. Thanks for always being available to come and shed light on this, and the work that is being done obviously is not in vain. Thank you very much for being in the Situation Room today. Of course, we will see you in the future once again.